Okay, so what brought you to Canada?
Uh, After the war, there wasn't much work in Scotland, but I wasn't in the working group at that time, you know. But my father had worked all over the place, and he thought he had a couple of brothers who had already emigrated to Canada, and they were at him to try and come over here. He says, you might have a better start. So he thought that even with the weather and all that, he was a plumber in construction. You know, in those days, the job was affected by the winter. It'd be a shutdown, but you'd still be able to make enough money during the year. And the prospects were better, perhaps, for raising children or kids than they would have been in Scotland at the time. This is in the mid-50s, early to mid-50s.
Coming to Canada?
We sailed from Greenock, which is just outside of Glasgow, to Montreal. It took 6 nights, 7 days. And we left in the sunshine, believe it or not. Even when you sail down the Clyde, you go by a place called Canada Hill. This hill, and it's the last part of Scotland you see before you set sail in the Atlantic for Canada. So once we got round there and out into the Atlantic, we never saw the sun for 6 days because it was in the North Atlantic and it was cooler. And that's the iceberg, you know, where the Titanic now is. There was no icebergs then, but it was cold. And it took us 6 days. And we woke up one morning in the cabin, they could see the light coming through. We were in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and that was the first time I'd seen the sun shining in 6 days. And I always remember that sail up the St. Lawrence. It was beautiful, you know. I was kind of enamoured with it, you know. You could see the South Shore mostly. We stopped at Quebec and overnighted there. Some people got off in Quebec, then sailed overnight to Montreal, and that's where we disembarked. And one of my father's brothers picked us up in a car, loaded what we'd brought with us. It was my mother, my younger brother, my younger sister, and myself. And my dad was already here, and he had come up with his brother. We drove to Toronto from Montreal.
The process like?
You had to apply to Canadian Immigration, and they had an office in Glasgow. And you go in and fill in forms, and you had to have a medical and an x-ray. You had to pass that medical and have an x-ray that you didn't have anything like TB or anything like that. You couldn't just show up. And they processed all that, and then I think it took a few months before you get the okay one way or the other, and then you had to go and pay for your own boat trip to Canada. You weren't subsidised, you know. And once you got here, immigration, you met immigration, you had papers and all that to show that. Plus I had a British passport at the time, which was valid in Canada in those days too, you know, to show who you were.
What challenges did you face before coming to Canada and after in Canada?
Well, the prospects were not always that great in Scotland, you know. There was the shipyards and coal mining and trades, and if I'd studied a little harder, I probably could have gone to university, but that would have been a burden on the family as well. So that was kind of out of the picture in many cases for working class regions, you know. But that's what my father thought, that overall the better prospect for everybody, and that meant the whole family, was to emigrate. And Canada was closer. He didn't fancy the United States. The other alternative would have been South Africa or Australia. But Canada in those days, this is before you flew over the Atlantic, you know, you could fly, but not the way it is nowadays. So a boat ride to Canada seemed like the easier option.
And then now, like, how hard was it, like, after Canada? Like, when you
Was it
came?
going yet? It wasn't. I realised that I had to go out and get a job too to help bring money into the family. And there was a friend of my father's, his daughter worked for Bell Canada, and she got me an introduction card to go down, you know, and you had an interview, and I found out about 2 weeks later that I had to go down for a medical. They were going to hire me. Strong back and a weak mind. I was a lot younger and bigger then, so got a job in construction with the Bell, as a lineman and stuff like that, you know.
Okay.
And how long did you work there?
Difficult was it to get a job?
At that time in Canada, there were a lot of jobs, you know, like, but I could have went into trades like my father and a plumber, but I didn't want to because I saw it was seasonal. And somebody said if you got a job with the Bell, it tended to be year-round employment, but you didn't make as much as an hourly rate as the plumbers did. But at least you were still working, you know. So the big impetus was to have a wage to bring in to help with the rent and the food and that, you know, if my father was laid off, you know. So for the first almost 3 years, I actually turned all my money into the house, you know. That was just the reality of the things, you know. So it's things like that, you know, you weren't kind of, even though you were staying at home and you had a job, you weren't completely independent, if you know what I mean, you know. And by this time I'd met a few guys and we were playing football or soccer and that, you know. We went out to dances at night here, you know, there's little clubs and stuff like that, you know. It wasn't the nightclubs here, the bars in those days, you know. And that's how we socialised back then, you know. And then once I could get back on my feet, my father ended up working fairly steadily, and my mother actually ended up getting a job with Eaton's catalogues. You know, she used to take the over the phone people would be ordering stuff. She ended up there, so things were going pretty good then financially. And then from then on, you know, I was in construction with the Bell. I was actually making fairly good money, and there was overtime, and you know. So that was me. That was me kind of settled down. Then I went back to Scotland. The first time I actually went back, we'd be here 4 years. I was 61. That was the first time I went back to Scotland, and that's when you do notice the difference between what you have here, especially when it came to food and things like that. You know, like when I grew up in Scotland, there was rationing right through into the 1950s. You know, you were only allowed to buy so much of this, and you had stamps, and there was rationing, I think, in Canada for a while during the war, but the rationing went on in Scotland well into the 50s, you know. So the availability of things like that, you know, different foods, you know, like, you know, the cuts of meat that I never saw in Scotland. We couldn't afford them, you know. Even things like chicken. The only time I saw chicken in Scotland was for Christmas dinner. And yet there was no shortage of them, but just couldn't afford them, you know. So it's things like that. And then when you go back to Scotland, you could see, after being here for a few years, that you could see the comparisons then.
Better life here.
Yeah, I knew it was better here, you know. Yeah, from Scotland.
Yeah, so how different were like the laws in Canada? So like when you came from Scotland, like how different were they? Like, did they feel like home or?
Yeah, you know, if you're law abiding, the laws don't, you know, no matter where you go, you can get yourself in trouble if you don't obey the law. It's that simple, you know. But the laws in Canada, a lot of things here went around the car, which we didn't have in Scotland, you know. So there was things you had to learn how to drive and obey the driving laws and, you know, like all this kind of stuff. But as far as everything else went, you know, you couldn't steal, you couldn't, you know. There was very little, you know, there was very little guns, you know, there was hardly any guns in Scotland. But in Scotland there was a lot of violent crime, knives and razors and stuff like that. You didn't see that here. So in a lot of ways, Glasgow was probably a lot more violent than Toronto was. And the other thing was, when I came here, Toronto was a very, very clean city then. There was no rubbish blowing up and down the streets. People put the garbage in bins and that. That was the one really noticeable thing, you know. Plus, when you went into the shops and the supermarket, the service in the shops was way better. And that was one of the things I found really noticeable, you know. Plus the cleanliness in the street, the city.
Would you rather live in Scotland or back in Canada still?
No, I still ride. I married here, had kids here, grandkids here. This is my home, you know. Scotland's a place I visit. I still love the place, but I don't think I could actually go back and live there anymore. Although things have improved greatly there too in the past 50 or 60 years too, you know. But this is my home.
Alright.